I'm an evangelical minister. Praise be thou, Lord God, King. That goes to the core of my identity. My constituency would be conservative, very conservative.
Thank you, NRA! Thank you!
In my community, we talk about the sanctity of life, the value of every human life.
When I would hear about shootings, I would pray for the people, but I never thought it would ever happen to us. We have replaced God with our guns.
It's so important that you help. They will listen to you.
As a Christian, what are your feelings when I say the phrase Christians and guns?
The Bible's very plain about a man who don't protect his wife and kids is worse than an infidel.
Is that a pro-life ethic?
The only thing that stops a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun.
Let's pray. Father, we know there's a lot of people in this country that would like to register guns and take them away.
If we take guns away, people are just going to kill people with something else.
So what we need is Jesus and the gospel and a sidearm. This doesn't speak to that. When faith becomes inseparably linked to a political position, we become vulnerable to selling our souls.
That's what this is all about, fighting for life.
I'm taking a big risk. I could lose my career. I am here today to challenge my fellow clergy. Let us cast off the works of darkness, fear, ignorance, hatred, vengeance, and put on the armor of light. Let's pray.
So welcome everyone to this evening. I'm very thankful that you have come, and what an exceptional opportunity we have, having just witnessed this amazing film, to have a conversation with two remarkable people whose lives we get to know in the film, and the amazing woman who created it. So we're very thankful. I want to thank, too, Riverside Church for hosting this, pulling it together, inviting all of us here, and having the vision and the tenacity it takes to move forward on this issue. It's a remarkable witness on the part of this community. So what I'm going to do, I'm Serene Jones. I'm the president at Union Theological Seminary right across the street. I could throw a stone and hit it if I wanted. I am going to introduce each of our three panelists, although they need no introduction. And then we're just going to have a conversation. You have seen them speak about this incredibly important issue as a faith issue and as an issue deeply connected to their own lives. Now we have a chance to hear them with us talk about these issues and bring insight to us. So first, I want to introduce Rob, who is an evangelical minister and founder of the Christian outreach organization Faith and Action, which is based in D.C. He is the immediate past chairman of the Evangelical Church Alliance, the ECA, America's oldest association of independent evangelical ministers, missionaries, and chaplains. As part of this work, Dr. Schenck has launched a website, and remember this, it's called Sword of the Spirit, a Christian conversation on gun violence, with the resources to help pastors, lay leaders, Christian college students, and others in the faith community. It provides resources that can help you discuss gun violence, and this is critical, through a theological lens. So you can learn more about this by going to swordofthespiritministry.org. Don't forget that. Lucy McBath is mother of Jordan Davis, an unarmed teenager who was shot and killed in Jacksonville, Florida in November of 2012. Since his death, Lucy has advocated for solutions to the problem of gun violence as a national spokesperson for Moms Demand Action for Gun Sense, in America. And she is currently the faith outreach leader for Everytown for gun safety. Everytown for gun safety. In her work as a gun safety advocate, she has been invited to the White House, she's testified before the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee, and she has appeared, as we saw in the film, on CNN and MSNBC, and she recently founded the Walk with Jordan Scholarship Foundation. And last but hardly least, we have Abigail Disney, who is the executive producer and director of this film, The Armor of Light. And she is a filmmaker, philanthropist, and the CEO and president of Fork Films. She has had a long-time passion for women's issues and peace building, culminating in producing her first film that I hope all of you have seen, called Pray the Devil Back to Hell. Write that one down too.
Now available on iTunes.
Now available on iTunes. Pray the Devil Back to Hell. It's not a rock song, it is a wonderful documentary. And then it was followed by a 5-part PBS series, Women, War, and Peace. iTunes. Disney is also the founder, Abigail, founder and president of wonderful title, Peace is Loud, a nonprofit organization that uses media and live events to highlight the stories of women who are stepping up for peace and resisting violence in their communities. Thank you, each of you, for being here, and not just here, but for being here in the universe, doing the work that you do. We're all very grateful for that. So I get to ask you some questions and have you respond. And I want to start with just a very practical question, Abigail, for you. How did you get started on this project? What drew you to it? And sort of how did this come to be?
I have been concerned about the gun issue for many, many, many years, and I followed it and paid attention to the political dynamics around it. And they really make you despair, the political dynamics. Because, when one side says X, the other side says X only a little bit louder, and so we just push back and push back. That's the definition of stasis, right? So I was trying to think of a way to talk about it that would take us around that deadlock. I have always wondered, if you take a gun with you, you need to be prepared to fire it. If you're prepared to fire it, you need to be prepared to kill someone. And so before you buy the gun, before you bring it to your house, before you even think of getting the license, you really need to have a conversation with yourself about whether, in fact, you're willing to take a human life. And I was so struck by the language being used in the gun lobby and a lot of the gun laws about the kind of bloodthirstiness. There was no dread. There was no, oh God, I hope I never have to do this. Or there was no conversation about, might there be another way? Maybe I could have a panic room in my house. Maybe I could have an alarm system. Maybe I could have a dog. All these different, we don't hear it. And here we are, this country famous for our inventiveness and our, and yet we weren't trying to invent our way out of this problem. So it seemed to me that we need to just take a step back and take a moral look at this disarrangement of our priorities. And the best place it seemed to me to go is to the people with the language about the sanctity of human life. And because one of the founding assumptions is, for me, these aren't conservative values. As I understood them, I was raised in a conservative household. I'm a progressive now, but I remember the values, and I don't really think I'm doing anything that much not in keeping with the conservative values. But the gun values are radical, social destabilizing values. So I wanted to find somebody conservative, somebody in the pro-life movement, who would be willing in good faith to have a conversation with me about how consistent the evangelicals in particular are about the sanctity of human life. And I talked to a number of different people, and I was very lucky to find Rob. I was crazy, ridiculous. I'm in church now, so I can say, yes, the author of the, brought Rob to me, or vice versa, but clearly that was just a wonderful match.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things that struck me about it so powerfully was very quickly how theological the documentary becomes.
Yeah.
Did you realize that when you started, that you were going on this not just moral and ethical, but theological journey into this issue?
Right. I mean, I refer to myself as a fundamentalist agnostic. That's the sect I belong to, which is none. But I'm a believing person.
Yeah.
And I was always the girl who was listening at church every Sunday, and none of it really ever left me. And it seemed to me that if we could find which way was up, it would be with a theological discussion. So it seems to me when you're talking about matters of life and death, the place to go for that is theologically speaking.
Mm-hmm. What we think about the meaning of our lives in the cosmos.
Yeah.
For me, one of the most powerful moments, Lucy, is in the film when you say that we've replaced God with guns. It just sits there. It's a huge statement about what we believe. Can you talk about when that realization came to you and what is in that?
Well, I mean, I really started recognizing that very early on as I was questioning God. How did you, why Jordan, why me? And so in questioning God, which is probably one of the only times I've ever really questioned God, and it was emphatically why. And then just over the course of the weeks after Jordan's death, and just really listening to God and really just, I was completely just somewhere else. And it was just really me and God. And what I began to recognize is that, morally we'd completely lost our way if, people in the country are so afraid of whatever their fears are, afraid of people that don't look, think, or act like them, and that they believe the only way that they can protect themselves is through gun violence. And so I started questioning, but Lord, you're not a God of fear. And so if we're fearing one another, if we're fearing each other, then we're completely out of order. And here we are, created one nation under God. Then how did we fall so far off the mark, putting more emphasis and displacing our reverence for God over our reverence for guns? And I was very confused by that, and I didn't quite understand how that happened. How could this happen? But then I have also said, too, all along the way, when you take God out of the equation of an individual's everyday life, these are the kinds of issues that we're dealing with now. Immorality, fear of one another, fear of people that don't think, look, or act like you. And I do, over the course of time, now that I've become, the gun expert, so to speak, I've understood how this has happened. But the theological and moral question for me is, how can people as Christians put so much faith in a gun that's become the God instead of the reverence for the deity of our Lord and Savior? And so I just questioned, this has to be addressed. This absolutely has to be addressed if we're going to be about the business of being our brother's keeper, if we're going to be about the business of, being the face of God, being the face of Jesus, then morally and ethically we have a responsibility to stand up and challenge what's been happening with the gun culture. And I just felt like that was the missing piece for gun violence prevention. I hadn't heard anyone talk about the immorality of guns. So I just started speaking out because I just knew that's what God was telling me to do.
The idolatry of guns. The gun becomes God. And Rob, in the film, you just go for it when you say, when you're describing the realization that it's not just that there's a theology over here and guns get stuck onto it, but guns are part of the deep spirituality. It's like part of the whole woof and weave of the faith system, which takes it to a whole nother level in terms of how we as a culture begin to address that. Can you talk to us about that?
Sure.
That really piercing insight.
And that's why the moment that you see literally in the garden, if you notice the setting where Lucy and I have that conversation, was the prayer garden in the rear of our ministry house on Capitol Hill. And it wasn't lost on me, the significance of the garden and Jesus' surrender to the will of God for him, even though his humanity, his human impulse was to do something else. But the will of God was his passion and death. So, in evangelical parlance, what Lucy delivered to me in the garden was what I would call a prophetic word. It was a word from God. And I had done my doctoral work late in life at age 50 and didn't submit my dissertation until 53. So I had really just come through an experience. The title of my dissertation work was Bulwark Against Political Idolatry, the necessity of a theology of church and state for American evangelical pastors, because I saw a theological void in that realm. And then Lucy comes and puts the problem of idolatry right on the table. So what you see in my face was not an affectation. I felt the power of her prophetic witness in that moment. And that in fact, at the core of this thing was a deep theological failing on the part of the church, which came in the form of idolatry, a substitute for the divine, an earthly substitute for the transcendent, for the heavenly. And that connected me to a lot of the work I had done for my dissertation, was in an examination of the German church crisis, which I saw as an antecedent to the horror of Adolf Hitler and Nazism and the mammoth catastrophe that followed. And I'm very aware that some of the prophetic voices of that time warned that the church must speak early and not late. And so when Lucy delivered that word, and I have to give credit where credit is due here, because Abby was the unlikely facilitator of all of that. I'm not sure Abby would have, at that time, self-identified as a prophetic agent, but she was, in every possible way. She created a space where Lucy could come and deliver the word of the Lord to me and to many more than me, but enough that it got me to that point of decision. And Abby knows all too well that I had reserved the right of an exit from this project
He
at
was
any
a huge
time.
fraidy cat. He was a big fraidy cat. And he signed the release really early in the process because I think he was afraid he would back out. But then there would be these weeks where he just didn't answer my phone call and didn't return phone calls. And I knew he was like thinking, no, this is terrible. So he was in and out of cooperation and in and out of enthusiasm. I thought he was just taking forever. It was making me crazy. And I knew if I put Lucy together with Rob, it was like, and I knew it. I knew he couldn't resist Lucy. Nobody can resist Lucy.
Well, there is a moment in the film. It's not a long moment, but it's a very crucial moment, and that is, Rob, when you begin to talk about race, that we can't talk about gun violence in this country without talking about racial hatred. Lucy, you are a direct experience of that, so close to home, that your son would be alive today if he had been white. And the film touches on that. It doesn't dwell on it. Was that a decision that you made, or how does that, what do we do with that?
You know, white people really have a hard time talking about race.
Yes.
And this film was very consciously pointed at white Christian evangelicals who vote around the gun issue. I wanted to make an appeal and an argument that they could hear. And we couldn't not talk about race completely, but particularly conservative white people, if you hit race too hard, you lose them. So we had to find the right balance. I mean, you should know, and we weren't able to get it into the film, that the church we went to was a very conservative church. They were, you know, I keep wanting to call him Barney Frank. What's his name? Ben Carson. He's so not Barney Frank. Not quite. They were Ben Carson Church. So this was, you know, the minute we started talking about guns, they sounded like Democrats to me. So I thought that was interesting. I mean, I've gone on to realize, and this is where I want to go with my next film, that white people are beginners at fear. Like, we are just figuring this out, right? We're suddenly, like, some terrorist might come in and shoot up the place. You know, black people have never not feared. Every single day they send their children out into the world wondering if they'll come home alive. So if we want to find spiritual leadership about how to live in fear with dignity and integrity, we need to be listening to the black church, because that is the place where it's been happening quietly for hundreds of years.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things you said earlier was, you know, people have to come to grips with the fact that when they buy a gun, they have to reckon with the reality that they might kill someone. And that is actually, I think, mostly how white people think about guns. They're being on the side of shooting.
Yeah.
They're not putting themselves on the receiving end and thinking, I might be shot by this gun. And that's the horrid reality of the world that we live in the United States.
I mean, that was precisely, and Rob said at one point we couldn't get it in the film, but it's, what side of the gun do you imagine yourself on? And that's almost totally determined by race. Almost totally, because white people just don't stand on the other side. And I think if you've ever spent any time looking down the barrel of something, you'd take it more seriously.
And it is interesting that it's easier, I'm not saying it's easy, but it's less disturbing to talk about guns than whiteness, in terms of how we begin to sort through culturally the whole warp and weave of the spirituality that sits at the heart of this violence. Did you learn something new about yourself? I mean, we watch discoveries happen during the unfolding of the story, but now, you know, watching it at a distance, do you see something about your own perspective on this that you never thought you would imagine that now just seems crystal clear to you?
Well, you know, having come from a very civil rights-oriented background with my father, my family, you know, it was civil rights. But I think my eyes have been open to the addition of, you know, morality in civil rights. I mean, that's a huge part that has to be identified. That's a huge part, the faith aspect, bringing the faith community into this kind of work. And so I know even as my father, I never really heard him talk much about God or, and he marched with Martin Luther King Jr. and everything, but that was Martin Luther King's realm, God and spirituality in the church. And my father's was specifically civil rights. But what I've come to recognize is that I have incorporated the best of my father and his work, but through my faith, I'm doing the work.
Powerfully. Was there something for you, Rob?
Well, there's so much to that. It's so multidimensional, and just the fact that it's not lost on me that the Lord would use a black woman to come and deliver notice of his will to me. And that was very potent. And all of a sudden, I'm having a lapse here. But you know the novel, The Shack?
The Shack, yes.
The Shack,
Yep.
right? And I'd read that. And I just thought it was magnificent that God is depicted, portrayed as a black woman. And that was just, I was conscious of that. It was somewhere in my consciousness. Okay. I thought that was a novel. But there was a moment, and I noticed we have a few copies of Sojourner's magazine out on the table in the, do you call it a narthex here?
Yes.
Or narthex. I know my lexicon for big buildings, the narthex. And I don't know how many copies we have, but that was a story I did, an article I did for Sojourners on this question. And I tell a story in there that I've rarely told because the nature of it was so highly charged, but it was when I sat in a closed-door roundtable discussion with pastors who were mostly Southern Ohioan, some were across the line in Northern Kentucky, and we sat around a dining room table. And I asked, how many of you have concealed carry permits? Every one of them, which was surprising enough to me. And then I asked, can you, well, actually I asked how many of you are armed at the table here? And every one of them were armed. And I said, can you help me to explore one facet of this? Because when I went firearms training, I was told that you must always be ready. When you draw the weapon, you must be ready to kill. Psychologically, you already have to be there. You've already killed. Because if you're not willing to kill in the instant, you are more dangerous with the weapon than without it, because it will likely be taken from you in a violent struggle and used to kill you and to kill others. So I said, do you agree with that? And they all agreed. They said, yes, that's true. You have to be prepared to kill at any moment. And I said, so help me to understand, as pastors, as spiritual leaders, when is the decision made to draw the weapon and kill? And there was a lot of uncomfortable body language around the table and kind of a little bit of hemming and hawing. And then finally, a gentleman spoke, and he was a seasoned minister. He was probably in his mid-60s, I'd put him. And he said, well, that would have to do with skin color. And I said, well, can please help me? The one thing, Abby set the tone from the very beginning of this project to create safe space where people can feel comfortable being transparent, and at least to some degree, and affirmed for who they are. And I tried to do that as much as possible, even though Inside, I was aghast at what I was hearing. But I said, can you help me to understand more about that? How does skin color factor into this? And he said, well, in this county, if a colored man comes into this county, and he used that anachronistic language, if a colored man comes into this county, he knows he doesn't belong here, which makes him more dangerous than a white man. And that's when I'm going to draw the weapon. And he wasn't entirely comfortable with admitting that, I think even to himself, but he said, that's the way it is here. Which told me that not only is this a theological crisis for us as evangelicals, it is a racial issue, problem. It's bigger than an issue. It goes to the very nature of the gospel. So it goes back, the race component is also a theological component, because if we understand the gospel is for the other, not for the same. I'm sure we have plenty of theologically astute people here, and you know your gospel, and you know that Jesus said, I didn't come, I came for the other, for the sick, for the stranger, for the other, for the black man in the white county. That's who the gospel is for. And that has to do with the love of God and the generosity of God and the saving nature, not the destructive nature, but the saving nature of God in Christ. So all of this, again, ties in. It can't be separated. It's not like we'll have a discussion on race and guns, and we'll have a discussion on ethics and guns, and we'll have a discussion on legislation and guns, and then we'll have a discussion over here, for me at least, on the theology of guns. To me, it's all theological.
It is. And Lucy, in your own bearing witness to this theologically, the courage to, well, early on in the film, you talk about stand your ground and the hinge of this category called perception, which is basically writing into the law permission to be racist. That's what that is.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So you named this early on. You can see it unfolding in front of you in terms of the trial, and yet out of that you have the courage to walk into communities where you are now so acutely aware of the hatred and the racism that's there. What is that like? I mean, enormous courage.
You know, it was so interesting. I've just been saying this to some people that I've been talking to recently, is that, having grown up in the civil rights movement, watching my parents, out in the marches and the rallies, and coming from Chicago, Illinois, I never really experienced the racism, the separatism. Didn't really, we were raised in a very integrated environment, so we didn't experience that. It didn't really dawn on me until Trayvon was murdered, that we're not as, integrated, and the mindset that I believe that I've been living under is not necessarily the mindset of a lot of people in this country. And so that was an awakening for me. Even more so, the awakening as I've been doing this work, spending a lot of time in predominantly white evangelical, environments, even wondering, when I walk in, how well am I received? Because I know the way that I'm being perceived, and so that has been an awakening for me as well. As I've even said to Rob, I've always wondered, as I walk in the door with Abby and Rob, and most of the people that I'm around are white conservative evangelicals, what must they think of me? And so how well will I be able to speak to the heart of man simply because they may not be able to listen to me because they're looking at this? And that overshadows my really speaking from my heart, what I know God is telling me to say. So it has been an awakening. It has been very different. The way I speak to, the minority audience is completely different because I don't have to spend the time talking to them about the ills of the gun culture because they know it already. There I spend more time pushing them. This is what we must do as a people. This is what we must do to save ourselves. You cannot expect that white America is going to come along and save us. We have to do this. We have to be about the preservation and the saving of ourselves, our futures, our generations. There will be people that will come along and assist us, but in the end, we have to do it. Versus the white audiences, predominantly white audiences, where I spend a lot of time getting you to recognize that this is a cultural, ethical, and moral issue that you too, as Christians, are to be concerned about and not turn a blind eye to because you're not affected by it. Because I have a very, very hard time with the fact that, the white evangelical community, when all the children died in Sandy Hook, they did nothing. Yeah. That was, and I thought, well, morally, where are we as
their own children?
Oh, their own children. Where are we as a nation? Where are we as a nation? But there again, that was with the white evangelical community, even though I know my community's been suffering that for years.
I will say about Sandy Hook, actually, my husband and I had an agreement that I would wait to do a gun film until our last kid left for college. And it was Sandy Hook that got me going, in spite of the fact we still had kids at home, because two sets of people took the identical fact set and took it in the opposite direction, both from a moral framework. That's the thing about the conservatives. They weren't saying they didn't care about the kids at Sandy Hook. They were saying, if you care about your children, you will get more guns. And this is proof of what we've always been saying, whereas, our people were sort of saying, this is proof there are too many guns and we need to get them. So when you have two sets of people taking the same fact set and running the opposite direction with them, you've got a real problem. And that's why it seemed important to look from a moral framework, because practically speaking, there's no talking about specifics with anybody. It just drives us further and further apart. So we were kind of a no fact zone. We were a no, we didn't talk about legislation. We didn't talk about anything specific because that was the best way to lose people.
And one of the things that, Rob, I think you say it in the film, although it's mentioned over and over again, that at a moral level and that space, across all these categories, we live in a country that praises equality. Christians supposedly believe in equality, but we actually don't think that all people are equal.
That's the truth. Yeah.
We don't believe that.
Yeah. I had my mind blown last weekend in the church basement at Judson when we were talking about racism and how do you define racism. And we all talked about it as a system of disadvantages or barriers or all these kinds of things. And then someone came out with, no, it's a system of advantages, not disadvantages. And my mind was blown because that is perfect, because it doesn't locate the problem with the people of color. It locates the problems with the people enjoying the advantages. And it never crossed my mind. But if you think of it that way, that you're not that afraid your son will get shot, that you're confident they'll get into a good college, that you're, confident that you'll be taken seriously if you testify in a trial, or all these kinds of advantages that are invisible to us need to be made visible, or there's just no progress.
I want to, you all have probably heard of this book, but a very wonderful theologian has written a book called Stand Your Ground. African-American woman writes about the racism underneath Stand Your Ground, but also gun violence as a theological issue, and how the church can begin to take action. Kelly Brown Douglas. But Abby, in Pray the Devil Back to Hell, you give us this politically charged life and death situation, and at the end, it's a victory. Yeah. And there's no ending victory in this story. Mm-hmm. How do we get to the end of Pray the Devil Back to Hell? Right. In the end of the Armor of Light?
I know for a fact there's no single piece of legislation or set of ideas that will get us to whatever the finish line looks like. And I don't even know what the finish line looks like. If it were up to me and I were making all the decisions, we'd take all the guns away and melt them into plowshares, and everybody lives happily ever after. And that's an incredibly I would eliminate the Second Amendment if it were up to me. That is as radical a thing as you can possibly say when we talk about the gun. And so I'm a realist about where we are politically. I think if in my lifetime I can see let's ban the Second Amendment not be such a radical thing to say, I will have made very significant progress. So I'm setting myself up to do work that I will have to trust will have to be carried forward well past my death, because this is a massive culture shift. You know, there's one guy who says it's in our DNA, and that one always drives me nuts, because, you know, people always say that with a little bit of glint in their eye and a sparkle kind of, you know, it's kind of like a boys will be boys sort of thing to say. It makes us charming to ourselves that we have the gun and we have the Western thing and the self-reliance and the rest of it. And so, first of all, not only does it not mean anything, I mean, what the hell are we talking about in our DNA? But that's not actually true, because at all of those imaginary towns where the people were walking down the street with their guns, there were gun control laws in those towns. And the sign at the entrance to Tombstone, Arizona said, "Please leave your guns with the sheriff." Nobody walked down the street with guns, and the fact that there was a shootout at OK Corral was because the sheriff was trying to enforce the law. So first of all, that's an imaginary zone. But if you actually go back to the 1880s, 1890s in this country, and you really ask yourself what was happening outside of Tombstone, what was happening in the urban centers? Well, we were establishing a tradition of human services and philanthropy and accepting immigration into our midst and building systems of feeding the hungry and housing the homeless. That's what we were doing at the same time. If anything is in our DNA, it is equally that. And so this is all about narratives, right? And the narrative we tell ourselves about our country has to change. Yes. We tell ourselves a narrative that we're Rambo and Rambo's good, right? And we need to switch to where, I don't know, Pinocchio, and Pinocchio's good. We need to shift a narrative to one where peace is a dignified, noble, strong position to take. It's not passive. It's not quiet. It's not a sissy thing. So we need to turn this narrative over, because if we don't, we're talking about perpetual conflict.
And for Christians, that narrative already exists that needs to be put in place. It's so clear. It's not even a complicated one. But
so much about the fantasies we have in our heads about who we are.
I like to remind people that, you know, peace is our first condition as humans. You know, almost every one of us. I mean, there are some people for whom it's an exception. But for the most part, we're born, we're received into happy, loving arms, we're taken care of, we're smiled at, we slowly grow in attachment and humor and warmth and love. Peace is our first condition. It's the first thing we really know as human beings. So it's already in us. You know, it's a question of reaching back and remembering and bringing it out into our lives.
And how are we going to get there, Lucy?
Well, I spent every day of my life trying to get us there. I think it's just recognizing how over time, and this is where Rob and I kind of, he deals far more with the theological and the moral, and I deal with theological and moral issues of gun violence. So I deal a lot with our legislators and our civic leaders and academia, talking to them about the immorality of the gun culture. And most definitely, the NRA gun lobby has been running ramshack over the nation for the last 25, 30 years, creating this fear narrative. You be afraid of anyone that doesn't look, think, or act like you. You need to arm yourselves. It's going to happen. You're going to be hurt too. Also too with the, it's this symbiotic relationship that falls right in between that narrative. Of course, if, the NRA gun lobby's putting everyone at arms, so to speak, and they're fearing for their lives, they're going out and they're buying more guns. And as they're continuing to buy more guns, because the narrative for them is that every household should be armed, then of course the gun manufacturers are making money hand over fist. So that kind of narrative, that kind of fear-mongering is what's been driving the NRA gun lobby's legislative and their extremist measures for all these years. So it's a matter, I say that, in the work that I do, we are re-educating America to the truth. Once you know the truth, you do better. But you have to be exposed to the truth. So as I'm talking to people around the country and I'm testifying and talking to our legislators, even some of the legislators don't even know what the gun laws are within their own states. Mm-hmm. Most definitely, the constituents, the people in the community don't know what the gun laws are within their own states. So if you don't know what the gun laws are and you see these kinds of tragedies happening over and over again, you're left to say, well, how is this happening? How is this happening? Well, there again, the laws are being instituted at the state and local level. A lot of our existing gun laws have been watered down, so to speak, meaning the common self-defense laws that every state has. Those laws are being watered down, making individuals in this country that have arms or buying guns, making them less accountable for the ways in which they use them, which is extremely dangerous. And a lot of the gun laws now are being used based upon perceptions of fear, not even credible threats. And so when you start to water down the existing gun laws, and there are loopholes in them that allow tragedies to happen, such as what happened with the Emanuel 9 in Charleston, the Charleston loophole. When you have gun sellers that are selling individuals guns without getting the bona fide FBI background check back before they have the authority to sell the gun. These kinds of tragedies are happening over and over and over again. So I liken what I do is to educating America as to the truth of what the gun culture is. Our accountability and responsibility as human beings to care about people outside of ourselves, to be caring about the saving of mankind and humanity, which is what Jesus was here for, to save us. And so we are to be a walking witness every single day, being the face of Jesus. And so I liken myself to reminding people their godliness, in this issue, which people usually don't consider God and guns, but, and they say, well, they're diametrically opposed to one another. They absolutely are not in the ways in which they're using them. We're diametrically opposed. God is, diametrically opposed to the use of guns in the way that we're using them. But we have to find, the element of God again in our goodness and our humanity for even those that don't look, think, or act like us. And so we're all responsible and accountable to making sure that the extremist gun culture is shifted and changed. And it's been 25, 30 years since the NRA gun lobby has been pushing this extremist agenda. And so we're playing catch up now. We're, battling laws all around the country. Most of them, a lot of them we're kind of losing right now. I like to say we're losing forward, but over time it's changing the culture, changing one mindset at a time. getting people to understand their humanity again, and being concerned about what's happening within their communities with the gun culture, and being concerned about wanting to preserve their futures and their children's futures.
I would just add to that, Lucy alluded to this, for me, this is a question of Christian formation and discipleship. And when we, I think there will be church leaders at this conference that's coming up. Does that start tomorrow?
Tomorrow.
Yeah. Which is a wonderful place to start, because in my community, and this is where I become very parochial. I try to expand, and I'm working on it, but I become very parochial, because for me, on my side of the equation here, I want to help pastors especially to see this as a question of Christian formation. What kinds of Christians are we forming in our churches? And whether pastors at this point want to face it or admit to it or not, the reality is in our white evangelical churches, more and more people are armed in the pews. And for me, one of the tipping points was discovering how many of my colleagues, fellow evangelical pastors, are now armed for defensive purposes. I think hunting is a different question. I would discuss that in a different way. But for defensive purposes or offensive purposes. And how many of those pastors are now armed in the pulpit. And a number of them said to me in the course of this investigation, I wouldn't dare go into the pulpit without my weapon, without being armed. And one pastor I've known for decades said to me, if someone so much as stands up in my church and yells, they'll be sorry they ever did, because I'll take them out right from the pulpit. Well, so this is more than just Christian formation in the pew. This is Christian formation in the pulpit, which takes us to the seminary and the Bible college and the Bible school, where we form our church leadership. And I've preached and taught for a long time that, conversion begins in the heart. So if the heart is right, then the head has a better chance of being right. And if the head is right, then our actions, including what we do in interacting with legislators and public policy, will be better. So let's go for the heart, and we have to hurry. I know we have to hurry on this. I know we don't have the luxury of long, protracted periods of time. This is an urgency for the church. It's much like what happened in Germany, and it's why you saw the opening of the film as a quote by Dietrich Bonhoeffer, which was a gift from Abby to me, because I call him my dear Dietrich, and I refer to him as my best dead friend, and he helps me. And I was telling you earlier, I have a large portrait of him in my study, and I regularly engage in discussion with him. And mostly, he leaves me at a place saying, you have to find this for yourself and your own path here. There's no formula for it. So what I appreciate so much about what Abby did in crafting this film, and I'm going to tell her for the first time, I think, tonight, this, that she told a story about me that I was incapable of telling about myself. Wow. And I will be forever grateful to you, Abby, for that. And what Abby did was she invited all of us into a conversation and a journey to travel together. And that's what I'm hoping to do with church leadership, is to say, this is simply an invitation to a journey we must take together. But we have to hurry. We really have to hurry. We have to make this an urgent pilgrimage to find a new place, spiritually, morally, and ethically.
And I want to say one thing too about for Abby, because I remember from the very beginning when she came to me in specifics, and I didn't know for a very long time that she was just following the two of us. I thought in creating her film she was following other subjects, and one day I just said, "So who else is in the film?" And her staff said, "Well, just you and Reverend Schenck." And I thought, wow.
I asked her exactly the same question,
I had
separately.
I had no idea. And in the very beginning, I said, well, what kind of film is this going to be about? What is it you're trying to achieve here? And she said, she says, I don't know. I'm just going to let the Spirit lead us. And I really appreciated her saying that, because I felt like truly she let the Spirit of the Lord completely reveal to her along the way, instead of her forcing it to be what she wanted it to be. She let it unravel spiritually through God's hands as the tool that it has become, that truly is changing hearts and minds. Instead of loading it down with statistics and graphs and attitudes, she just let it evolve into something that's very organic, very spiritually alive, and something that really is changing hearts and minds. So I'm grateful to her for that.
I will say, that is a terrifying way to make a film, I should just tell you. It's like I did not get a lot of sleep. But that's why you can't wrap it up in a bow at the end, right? Because there is no way to wrap this up with a bow. It had to be an invitation to a conversation. And you had to come out with a lot of questions and a desire to interrogate this with you and your friends and your relationships. That's what I wanted. I didn't want people to come out of it like they did Pray the Devil Back to Hell, saying, yay, everything is possible, because this is, we never had this conversation and we needed to start.
So one last question. The next 2 days here at Riverside Church, millennials, this is focused on millennials, are going to be talking about this and strategizing and thinking. And anyone who would show up for this gathering and come to this movie, is already very sympathetic to everything we've been talking about. In just 2 sentences maybe, could each one of you say to this audience, what is the one thing that a group like this is going to have the hardest time thinking about?
Well, I'll tell you what I think. We all have this problem, which is thinking highly of conservatives. That is a very difficult thing for progressives to do. And if we are going to make a difference in this conversation and lead a theological inquiry into the whole question, we can't go into it with a fixed position that we intend to enlighten the conservative with, but rather an open enough heart and a willingness to admit that there are things you don't know, things you might learn, and that this is not some, rube from the country who's been duped into thinking these things. There may, in fact, be legitimate reasons why they believe what they believe.
That's hard. Lucy, what are we going to have a hard time thinking about?
I think most of you will probably leave here thinking, okay, so now I've learned about what's truly happening in the world, but surely there's nothing I can do about it. What can I do about it? I don't know how to go about doing anything about it. And so I think that's what I usually see in people's minds and eyes as they're, as they're watching and listening. And so what I always challenge people to do is I say you have to be about the business of doing the research to find out what's truly going on in your communities. You have to be about the business of advocating for people outside of your communities. You have to be about the business of caring about, people outside of your community, even though you think it's not, even though you think that you're not going to be a recipient of gun violence. A bullet doesn't know color of an individual's skin. They don't know your ethnicity, doesn't know your ethnicity, doesn't know your religious upbringing, and no one is immune to it anymore. And so I always think that the thing that I challenge people to do is that it is not really that hard. You say, what can I do? Just make sure that you understand what's happening within your communities, the gun laws that are within your state. And more than anything, if you're not happy with it and you're not happy with what you see happening in the streets and the nation at large, you have a right to vote your legislators out of office that are passing these laws. That's the biggest, most important, tool that you have is your right to vote. And so at the state and local level where the laws are being passed, federal laws not mirroring federal laws not mirroring the state law. Your state and local legislators are passing these gun laws that allow these kinds of atrocities to continue to happen over and over again. So you need to be knocking at their doors. You need to be making phone calls. You need to be challenging them to be about the business of protecting your futures and your families. And that really can be done. So yes, you have the power and you can do that.
Can I jump in with something? I'm sorry,
Yes, go.
Making this longer. I'm not kidding about the importance of the narrative that we accept about ourselves as Americans. And narratives can be changed. The head of the NRA himself said to me, I said, what are you most proud of? And he said that we changed the narrative on gun ownership in this country. Mm-hmm. The narrative that can be changed this way can be changed back. Mm-hmm. And so each of you, we live in a wonderful time. Each of you is a network, and each individual in your network is a network, and so on, and so on, and so on. We need to stop rewarding the narratives. I mean, just any movie by Michael Bay, just don't go. Don't give him your money. Don't reward that narrative. But you know what I'm talking about, the kind of film and television show that uses aggression and conflict as the first step in conflict resolution. And it's interesting, the film Argo is a great example of a peace narrative. And it was constructed like a really exciting, thrilling suspense film, but it was a peace narrative. This was about conflict resolution without firing a shot. And then you need to reward peace narratives, and you need to get to your networks and talk to them about how important this is. I guarantee you that if we shift the narrative in this country, the laws will follow.
Mm-hmm. Well, what are we not going to want to think about? What's going to make this group really uncomfortable?
So I do have the two-sentence answer to that, but I just have to add just a little something, only because I have slowly seen a supreme irony in the fact that in my community, the cardinal tenet that's being defended here, the Second Amendment, is in fact an amendment.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. It is a change. So it suggests that change can happen because that's what we're celebrating, is change and adaptation and modification. But the two-sentence answer quickly would be resisting the temptation first to preach only to the choir. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that is always more comfortable, and that comes from a preacher. I'd always rather turn to the choir and see them excited about my message. And secondly is to replace contempt with honor. To even honor our opponent, the oppositional person, the difficult person, the angry, the fearful, the narrow. Somehow we have to get to a place where we can honor and affirm rather than dismiss with contempt. And that's a constant temptation for me, and I think it's our big challenge.
Well, what a word to end on. Join me in thanking the three of our heroes